Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this very special ANU Indonesia Institute election roundtable. My name is E. Warburton. I'm the director of the Indonesia Institute here at the ANU, and I'm a senior lecturer at the Coral Bell School of Asia Pacific Affairs and in the Department of Political and Social Change. Before we begin, as we always do here at the ANU, I want to acknowledge that our campus is on the traditional and unceded lands of the Ngambri and the Ngunnawal people, and on behalf of the Institute, extend my respects to the elders past and present. So thank you everyone for joining us. We have an incredible turnout. There's obviously a lot of interest in these elections. We have over 300 registrants. So first of all, thank you all for joining us and for being so keen to hear from our experts today. So we're going to be talking about Indonesia's upcoming elections. They're only a couple of weeks away. So on the 14th of February, Indonesians will choose their president. They will also choose their vice president and their legislative representatives all in the one day. Although today we're going to be focusing, I think, almost exclusively on the presidential race. So for anyone who in the audience who perhaps is not like us and is not obsessively following the news on Indonesian politics at the moment, there are three presidential candidates who are running, or presidential pairs, I should say. Prabowo Subianto, you should know his name. He is the current Minister for Defense. He is, of course, running for president now for the third time in a row. He ran in 2014, he ran in 2019, and he lost twice to the current president, Joko Widodo. Jokowi is constitutionally unable to run in these elections. He has reached the end of his 2 terms in office, but he still has skin in the game. Prabowo's running mate, his vice presidential running mate, is Gibran Rakabuming Raka, who is, of course, Jokowi's son. And we'll be talking a lot about that over the next half an hour or so. One of the other presidential candidates is Ganjar Pranowo of PDIP. He is the former governor of Central Java. He was a very popular governor of Central Java. He's running with Mahfud MD, a cabinet minister in Jokowi's government at the moment. And finally, the final presidential candidate is Anies Baswedan, former governor of Jakarta. His vice presidential running mate is Mohaimin Iskandar of PKB, one of Indonesia's Islamic parties, which is, of course, notionally affiliated with Nahdlatul Ulama. So these are our 3 presidential candidates. I'm going to be talking today about who's winning, why they're winning, and of course it's Prabowo that's winning, and how the election is being run. And then, of course, what a President Prabowo might mean for Indonesia, for Indonesia's democracy and its economy. And to talk about all of these issues, we have a really wonderful panel of experts who I'm going to introduce in a moment. Because I want my introduction to be very, very brief so that we have more time for discussion, because we only have an hour together, I'm going to describe their bios very, very briefly. It's not a reflection of, they actually have very illustrious careers and CVs, but you can look them up online. And so I'm just going to give a very brief introduction. Then we're going to launch into about 30 minutes of moderated discussion between myself and our speakers. We're going to keep it super informal, very conversational. And then we should have about 20 minutes or so for Q&A from the audience. So as you think of a question, please write it in the Q&A box. Please keep it really succinct. I'm going to probably choose the most succinct questions so that we have time for lots of questions. Okay, so with us today, we have Emeritus Professor Greg Fealy, obviously a very long-time observer of Indonesian politics, and he's particularly an expert in the area of Islam and Islamic politics. Nava Noania is one of our senior PhD scholars at the Department of Political and Social Change. Sorry, I should have said that is also where Greg Fealy is based. Her research also focuses on Islam, Islamic politics in Indonesia. Her research at the moment is very much focused on Islamist mobilization and opposition under Joko Widodo's presidency. And she's also done a lot of work on extremism and radicalism in Indonesia and Southeast Asia. Finally, we have Fabricio Susilo. He is a recent PhD graduate from the Crawford School here at the ANU, at the ANU's College of Asia and the Pacific. He's an expert as well in Indonesian politics, governance and political economy, and he's currently working in the political risk space. So a really wonderful group of experts here to discuss the elections. So let's get straight into it, because I want to fit in as much as we can in the next half an hour or so. So as I sort of alluded to just then, Prabowo is in the lead now in the polls. Although he lost in 2014, he lost in 2019, all the polls, no matter which one you're looking at, now suggest that it's his election to lose. So he's polling anywhere between 45 to sort of 50%, depending on which poll you're looking at. And if he pushes just over 50%, for those who aren't familiar with Indonesia's election rules, it means, and he gets 20% in 19 provinces, it means that Prabowo and Gibran, his running mate, would win in one round. If they don't make it to that threshold, it will go to a runoff, but between the first and second placed candidates. But what the polls are telling us is that even in a runoff, whether Prabowo faces off against Anies or Ganjar, he appears to have a very large lead over the two other candidates. So, Rito, I might start with you. Can you give us a sense of how we got here? How is it that Prabowo has established such a significant and convincing lead over Anies and Ganjar?
Right. Thank you so much, Eve, and hi everyone. Pak Greg, Nafa as well. It's good to be back with the ANU folks. And yeah, so going back to your question, Eve, I think the big elephant in the room here would be Jokowi, right? And the secret weapon that is not so secret anymore at this stage is that Prabowo Gibran has the full backup of President Jokowi, who is not shy of acknowledging it as well. But so that's one primary reason, right? I would like to push this discussion further, or perhaps going into how President Jokowi was able to provide such a support. How did he maintain such high approval rating at the end of his presidency? So I think part of the reason why is because there's been he has a solid economic and investment performance, right? He has abolished the negative investment list, and that has allowed a tremendous inflow of foreign direct investment, and that's part of the reason why there's a lot of confidence from investors and business community in terms of Jokowi's government performance as well. And high economic performance usually translate to high satisfaction from the voter side. And that partly explain why he was able to come up with such high approval rating, which he was able to use to put his support behind particular candidate, in this case Prabowo and Gibran. And I guess we should really highlight the fact as well that it is perhaps the first time in Indonesia's post-reformasi history that a president was able, nearing his term of office, to have such high approval rating, right? If we compare with the previous president, SBY, for example, his approval rating wasn't this high, and perhaps that affects his political and moral standing when backing up certain candidates, right? We remember back during SBY's time, his cabinet, his government was embroiled in, scandals and so on, and that clearly affected his high approval rating. But other than Jokowi's high approval rating and full backup here, I would say another important aspect would be material resource, right? That's another important aspect because we know that in a high-cost democracy like Indonesia, the possession of material resource and the mobilization of which is clearly a deciding factor in terms of establishing a clear lead in the polls. And just touching on that, a couple of days ago, we heard in the news that big conglomerates, Boy Thohir and the likes, have declared their support to Prabowo Gibran. So I would say those are my take on your question.
Yeah, I mean, it is fascinating to see how much Jokowi learnt from SBY in a way, or SBY's mistakes potentially. He was very determined not to be a lame duck president. He's maintained his incredibly high approval ratings, as you said, on the back of sort of pretty solid economic performance. But he also went further than SBY because SBY didn't orchestrate for his son to end up on a presidential vice presidential ticket the way that Jokowi did. So in many ways, Jokowi is so invested in it now that, you know, those high approval ratings have become incredibly important to him because it's so incredibly important to a Prabowo-Gibran victory. So I might move to Greg now. Prabowo has this really clear path to victory, whether it's in a first round or a second round. But, you know, it's been so obvious in the media that, you know, no one is relaxed, at least in the Prabowo camp, no one is relaxed about this, despite this huge lead, least of all Jokowi. He's clearly very anxious to get this done in just one round. So how would you explain this anxiety on the part of the president about getting this all done in one round?
Thanks, Eve. Yes, Jokowi's anxiety is, it tells us something about his political personality, because in lots of ways he should be delighted with how things stand at the moment. We only need to go back a year where Prabowo was the backmarker. He was the one who was running third, and there was serious talk about trying to persuade him from not running. And so I think it's easy to forget just in the space of a year how dramatically Prabowo's position has changed. His prospects have changed. And nonetheless, Jokowi, having already received quite a bit of criticism from the media, from academics, sometimes from civil society about his interventions to help Prabowo, he nonetheless is pushing even harder to get Prabowo to win in a single round. And I think this is part of his psychology of never wanting to leave anything to doubt. And in his case, going to a second round brings risks with it that he would rather avoid if he can. We know that once the first round is concluded on the 14th of February, there's going to be a lot of renegotiating and new alignments and things like that. Particularly interesting to see what kind of dynamic prevails between Anies and Ganjar. It's very unlikely, even if the Anies and the Ganjar camps were to come together, it is still very difficult to come up with a scenario that would have them seriously challenging Prabowo, because he is so far ahead, and he's particularly so far ahead in the head-to-head surveying that's been done. And we know that a certain percentage of Anies's supporters will transfer to Prabowo if we get, say, for example, Ganjar being the leading candidate. So as I think, you know, both you, Eve, and Rido have mentioned, it's very likely Prabowo wins. It's just a matter of whether it's in one round or two, and it's going to be a very closely run thing. I wonder also if a factor in Jokowi's thinking is that a second round will open up even far more searching and vicious attacks, or kind of vituperative attacks on some of Jokowi's policy initiatives. If you just think of the Nusantara capital city project, we've already had Anies really making that an election issue. The more these issues become a matter of public debate, you imagine that Jokowi is probably wondering, might this increase the possibility that an incoming President Prabowo might think twice about continuing with them, even though that seems to be part of their agreement. So, so anyway, I think all of those are reasons why Jokowi would like this done quickly and cleanly in February.
I will come to Nara in one second, but I just want to follow up with you, Greg. I mean, this obsession with getting this all done in one round, you know, it's really all about, as you said, you know, leaving nothing to chance, minimizing risk and securing Gibran, really, right, in office. But do we really know much about, you know, the extent to which Jokowi can really influence government once he steps down, even with Gibran sitting there in the vice presidential office? And do we know what Jokowi really wants? I mean, it seems like an obvious question. I mean, he wants power, he wants to sustain influence, but why, actually? You know, I think it is worth asking.
And Jokowi has said this himself. He's talked about how he believes he has a vision that will make Indonesia a much greater nation, as if he doesn't really credit anyone else can do as good a job as he can. So I think that's a conceit that's at the heart of this entire engineering effort to secure his post-election influence. But as you say, I mean, come October 2024, he will not have the powers and prerogatives of the presidency. It looks like he's going to appoint as many loyalists as he possibly can into key positions. And one interesting test of the relationship between Prabowo and Jokowi is how many of those people will Prabowo retain in those positions, people who have a very strong loyalty to Jokowi. But I think also with Prabowo, we've seen him for the last 4 years really engaged in an extraordinary effort of self-control, or this is the way I interpret it, because we know he's a very temperamental person. He probably has very negative feelings towards Jokowi because Jokowi was the person who deprived him of the presidency for 2 elections running. And now here he is in the twilight of his career. He looks as if it's within his grasp. But had it not been for Jokowi, he may well have been president nearly 14 years ago. So what kind of attitude does he really have to Jokowi once he's won the election? I'm speaking if it's almost a foregone conclusion, and I think it is. And I think this is one of the difficult things to judge because he's been extremely measured for the last 4 years as defence minister in almost all of his statements. And it may be that President Prabowo displays a similar level of self-control. But what we've seen during the election campaign is the emergence of the old Prabowo, the grumpy, the cantankerous, the more populist kind of Prabowo. And that might be the real Prabowo trying to get out. So this is one of the fascinating things of speculation I think we have to engage in. But I'm certain that Jokowi, one of his sources of anxiety is precisely this matter of can he trust Prabowo post-election? And it would only need a serious policy difference on the new capital city or on a major infrastructure project or Hillary's RC or something, a downstreaming, that might bring this matter to a head of whether Prabowo wants to be directed by Jokowi or whether he wants to step from outside that shadow and put his own personal stamp on the presidency. I'm pretty confident he will very quickly want to put his own distinctive stamp on it.
Thanks, Greg. I'm going to come back to Rico later to talk a bit more about sort of, a President Prabowo, what would it look like? But we have been talking about Prabowo as though it is a done deal, but there are other candidates still in the race. One of whom is Anies. So Anies Baswedan was sort of coming third for quite a long time. And just in the last few weeks, he now seems to be, in some polls, actually ahead of Ganjar. So coming in second, and potentially it would be an Anies Prabowo runoff if that's how the votes end up settling. Nava, you've followed Anies's supporters, you followed his campaign, on and off for years, supporters for years and the campaign more recently, and you've obviously been in Indonesia recently as well. How would you explain Anies's sort of small, but still, I think, not insignificant bump in the polls? How's he campaigning and how is he sort of envisioning around a second round campaign if it comes to that?
Yeah, thanks, Eve. I think, many of us are wondering if this, the change in his luck is due to Anies's own campaign strategy, or is it because of Muhaimin and his NU base, or is it the Islamist groups that successfully mobilized their followers for Anies? I think it's the former. I think Anies and his advisors deserve more credit. I think, Anies surprisingly became, or maybe not so for some people, became an appealing alternative to, many undecided voters who are desperate for an alternative, who are desperate for anyone else but Prabowo, asal bukan Prabowo, right? And this, I know a lot of, I don't know, you can see from the survey maybe, but I feel that a lot of these people tend to be educated. They formally voted for Jokowi, not because of his populist appeal, but rather because of, genuine idealism in that Jokowi can protect democracy and all that. And so why not Ganjar? Maybe some of these people initially considered Ganjar, but then Ganjar kind of failed a lot of the people's expectations. He failed to articulate a clear vision in many, many issues, from economic to like fringe issues like the Rohingya issues. Ganjar's comments have been very vague and ambiguous. He couldn't, and And then there is this kind of ingenuity in the sense that, you know, he's part of the establishment, but trying to disguise himself as an opposition when he criticized the current government. So like, for example, his comment on the omnibus law was very vague, you know, oh, are you going to change it? Oh, maybe we will revise it. But if the rules are already good, maybe not. So like, he doesn't have any clear stance on anything, and uninspiring in a way. Whereas Anies has somewhat more credible credibility as a self-declared agent of change. He has positioned himself firmly in the opposition camp. But it's not Ganjar, as I said, that explains Anies' popularity. It's also, you know, his Anies's recent attempt to use TikTok to appeal to Gen Z's younger generations, and the surprising guest star that stole people's attention, who is Tom Lembong, right? Who added to Anies' charisma and charm and the sense of, you know, they're highly educated and they know what they're talking about, kind of thing. So and then they're also trying to appeal to K-pop and K-drama fans, which are really massive in Indonesia and in Australia too, I suppose. And you know, we don't know how you know how much that contributed to his popularity, but you know, people have been talking about some of the K-drama fans that created social media accounts for Anies using terminologies that that are familiar to K-pop fans. But the reason I'm saying that NU is not a significant reason behind Anies' you know, slight but notable rise is, I think, because the Nahdliyin are overwhelmingly sympathetic to Prabowo. He's got long-term friends within NU, you know, people like Habib Lutfi and Muhaimin did help Prabowo, you know, travel around East Java, Central Java when he was still expecting to become his vice president. And secondly, the chairman of NU, Gus Yahya, and his brother, the Minister of Religious Affairs, have been a solid part of Jokowi's coalition and beneficiaries of his patronage. And not just Jokowi, you know, Gibran himself has expressed in public his commitment to NU, to pesantren, always mentioning santri as one of the, you know, the main components of Indonesian society. And he's been approaching the younger Kiai, Gus, Ning, you know, having like intimate holiday trip with the Gus. You know, so that's, and then that's what adds to Gibran's appeal, not just Prabowo, but also many lay traditionalists distrust Anies because he's associated with PKS, who is Wahhabi, which is, you know, terrible for NU. And for Islamists, I don't think they contributed. I mean, there have been, you know, Anies supporters since the beginning, militant supporters. So it doesn't explain the recent change. And what about the, you know, Rizik's endorsement, Ijtima Ulama for Anies? I think it only justified and solidified Islamist already existing support for him. And, you know, if you want, I can talk later about the difference between Islamist grassroots and elites when it comes to a reservation about Anies himself as a leader. But yeah, overall, it's because of Anies's campaign, I think, rather than NU or Islamist contribution.
I mean, it's fascinating, great analysis, Nava, because I mean, this is what Anies has always wanted, right? He's wanted to try and break away from the image that he had based on his campaign for Jakarta governor in 2016, 2017, that he was just an Islamist candidate, that he was, you know, the figure for Islamic conservatism and Islamism in Indonesia. And he wanted to present himself as a technocrat, basically, you know, right? Someone who governs for everyone and who governs, you know, based on data, based on knowledge, that he was ultimately a technocrat. And he also brought in Tom Lembong, not just because he's a technocrat, but also because he's of the Chinese ethnic minority. Because we know that Anies has always had a problem with minorities for the reasons I've just outlined. Do we know, and I don't know if Ridho can speak to this or anyone can speak to this, has he made any inroads with minorities in Indonesia? Because you can't really win an election without bringing in some minority votes. Or is that still sort of beyond him? We know he's getting in some of these more elite votes, you know, people, upper middle class voters, but has he made any inroads with minorities?
I mean, but just based on the survey numbers, no. I mean, currently Prabowo has the most votes from minorities. Yeah.
It sounds like Prabowo and Anies are both in the low 40% range for minority support, and Anies has around about 10% or less. So It's one of those things that he is acutely aware of, that it's very difficult to win a presidential election if you don't get 30 or 40% of the minority vote. So that's been a surprising change in Prabowo's, because everyone remembers he got only 3% of the minority vote in 2019. So for him to now have another 40% or so on top of that, not necessarily all due to his own campaigning, but nonetheless, that's a significant change in his fortune.
Yeah, that's right. That comes back to Wido's point that really this lead that he's established, what's different this year is having Jokowi's full and very obvious, very brazen now backing. Wido, I do want to come back to you and talk a bit about your area of expertise, which is understanding the business community in Indonesia, both domestic and international. Jokowi has his big message in sort of the twilight, year of his presidency. He's been that I am the president that can bring in investment, as you described. Investment has been flowing. It's been flowing more in the lead up to this election than it has, according to BKPM, the investment board, than it has in the lead up to previous elections, suggesting that, whether it's domestic or international investors, they're not holding back. They're not in a wait and see mode, as is often the term that's used. So right. I'm quite intrigued by that, because in previous elections, Prabowo was seen as the risky candidate, as the candidate that represented a bit of instability that business people and economists were often a bit worried about. So can you give us a bit of insight into how the business community views a Prabowo-Gibran presidency?
Right. Thank you, Eve. So I think on a more general note, businesses and investors would welcome any candidate who are pro-market, pro-investment, and pro-job creation, right? So these have been the tenets followed by past presidents and will likely be the mantra of present candidates as well. So none of the candidates would want to overturn that kind of good, positive investment climate that President Jokowi has built so far, right? So any victor would be welcome by the business community, the investors, as long as they adopt such principles. And as I've mentioned before, President Jokowi is especially notable for opening up the investment climate and then abolishing the negative investment list. So continuation of this policy will be pretty much appreciated by investors and business communities. And we all know that Prabowo Gibran is running on the platform of continuity. So their presidency will pretty much be welcomed by the business communities and investors.
Yeah, and I think that, obviously what's important to the business community too is, as you said, sort of stability and continuity. And I wanted to sort of ask to get your perspective on an issue that's been raised in the media in recent weeks that, was really unexpected. And there are these rumors that there are divisions in the cabinet now. I mean, Jokowi, one of the things that Jokowi has managed to do incredibly well, especially in his second term, was to keep a very coherent, very stable cabinet. Everyone's been unified in their message about, Jokowi's developmental vision. And of course, his own previous cabinets and previous presidents as well have often had trouble, kind of keeping that kind of coherence within a cabinet. So it's been very unified, but we've just been hearing these rumors recently in the media that there is division within the cabinet, some disquiet from key ministers about Jokowi's clear and very open partisan support for Prabowo and Gibran, including this idea that Sri Mulyani, Indonesia's very respected finance minister, would potentially be considering resigning. I mean, do these rumors, are they based in any kind of reality? And if you did see one or two ministers resign on ethical grounds, is that something that could disrupt the electoral map, or at least disrupt, investment? Right.
So on Sri Mulyani, I think the most important note to make here is that she is highly popular and highly regarded by the investment community and business community. So the resignation of Sri Mulyani in the short run will be a huge loss to Jokowi's cabinet, because really she's been the key behind Jokowi's solid fiscal and economic management throughout navigating the Indonesian economy and fiscal space throughout the crisis, the pandemic, right? So it will be a huge loss for Jokowi's cabinet. But on a more general note, resignation of cabinet members and if there is any resignation, I'm pretty sure they won't publicly state that it's based on ethical ground, right? So they will just resign, and the government will state that it's their choice, right? So there won't be any, they won't touch on any of the ethical aspect, right? But on a more general level, a resignation of cabinet members, we believe it won't cause any collapse of the government or public service, because there are line bureaucrats underneath those high-level ministers that will maintain or continue to do the daily task, right? So we know as well in some ministries, these top-level, echelon bureaucrats are sometimes even more powerful than the ministers themselves, right? They've been the primary agenda setters for the new incoming ministers. So it won't have any noticeable effect towards the business community and investors. But we don't know whether, I'm talking in the next, perhaps 5 to 10 years, right? As we know that there's a new law on the civil service, right? The new ASN law, and it provides, it allows for second echelon 2 bureaucrats to be staffed by non-organic bureaucrats, so by people from the private sector, right? And one of the interesting things I heard when I attended one of these business meetings, and there was I believe it was Arshad, right, who spoke during the meeting, is that in order to realize their gercep satset, motto, they want to replace not just the ministers, but also the echelon 1 and echelon 2 bureaucrats as well. So yeah, and the new ASN law allows that. So perhaps in the short to medium run, we won't see any politicization of the bureaucrats, public service, but in the long run, we would see more of that due to the new ASN law. And it is something, I would say, something for career bureaucrats, something to worry about, I would say.
That's fascinating. And just for our listeners, Arshad Rashid, right? The head of Ganjar's campaign team, and also the sitting chair of Kadin, Indonesia's Chamber of Commerce, very big business person. That's fascinating. Thank you so much. So I want to turn to Q&A in a moment, but I just thought I'd end with some thoughts from Greg. We talked about the international business community a little bit. I just wanted to sort of end on the international kind of foreign policy community and international relations. So, you obviously followed Indonesian politics for a long time, and Prabowo is a very familiar character to you. And back in 2014, we talked a lot about his sort of illiberal roots, his authoritarian pedigree, his kind of a tendency to be quick to anger, these sorts of things. What do you think? I mean, let's just say he may have changed a little bit, but some of those characteristics remain. What do you think, what kind of president would he be on the international stage? What kind of impact do you think Prabowo might have, if any, on Indonesia's international relations?
I think he'll come into the presidency with much greater credibility internationally than what Jokowi had. Although Jokowi was a very successful businessman internationally, he didn't really bring any great insights or indeed a great deal of interest in international affairs, diplomacy, strategic relations, and things like that. We all remember those stories early on in his presidency where he would very quickly become bored with briefings about upcoming diplomatic meetings and things like that. And that would often show in the kinds of remarks he made at those meetings. So he's grown into the role and he's become more engaged in those international issues. And the last couple of years have been quite good ones for him in terms of, chairing the G20, chairing ASEAN, various other things he's done, which have attracted quite a lot of international attention to Indonesia. But I think Prabowo will be a different case entirely because he's much more internationally attuned. He's lived overseas, of course, going right back to his childhood when his father had to flee the country to avoid corruption charges, and he's had businesses overseas. He speaks very good English. He's got German. I think he's got a couple of other languages. So I think he's quite at ease within an international setting. And because of his military background, he also has a very strong grasp of strategic issues. One question would be whether a lot of his strategic understanding is a strategic understanding gained in the 1980s and 90s and not one that's sensitive to the very peculiar polycentric dynamics that we now have globally. So how well is Prabowo able to navigate a path to Indonesia through a much more complex regional and global set of strategic circumstances? One of the criticisms of him, for the most part, he's drawn fairly favourable remarks for his time as Defence Minister. But one of the things that people have said about him is that in meetings, he often speaks as if we're still coming to the end of the Cold War. And there's this question about how up-to-date he is. That might just be a matter of him having good advisors and listening to them. But I think when he enters a room, he's a man who commands attention, which is not always said about Jokowi. I don't mean to be unflattering about Jokowi, and Prabowo's reputation will have preceded him, and I think people will be wary of making an unfavourable impression on him, particularly in early days. So that should lead to some very interesting diplomatic meetings over the next couple of years if he becomes president.
Thanks so much, Greg. Okay, so to the Q&A, and we've got so many questions, so it's obviously going to be hard for me to choose one, but I'm going to choose one that gets to a question that I didn't have the opportunity to ask, and it's about the execution of the elections, about the freeness and the fairness, because we know that Indonesia has long been sort of hailed, even though for all of its other sort of democratic flaws and weaknesses, it's widely understood to have been holding very competitive and relatively free and fair elections over the last 20-25 years. So it's a question from Margaret Scott. I thought it was from Margaret Scott, but in brackets it says this is Sydney Jones. So Margaret and Sydney are obviously sitting together somewhere. And their question is, how serious are reported efforts to corrupt the KPUD, so the regional electoral commissions, so that there is a turnout of more than 50% vote for Prabowo Gibran? And if anyone can answer that specific question, that would be great. But a more general question is whether we are convinced that these elections are being run in a free and fair manner compared to those that have come before. And I'm opening that up to anyone. Would anyone like to offer a response to that? Or I can read a second question.
I'm not confident if.
Yeah, the only thing I would say, Eve, I don't know about the regional or the local KPU. It would stand to reason. And in a way, this is one of the problems of the way Jokowi has done things in the last few years, the way in which he has undermined or bent to his will key institutions, the integrity of which should not be readily questioned. And I mean, the election commission, the KPU, is criticised at every election. It seems to me the KPU this time has come in for more criticism, and a lot of it deserved. Issues to do with transparency, the rules for the presidential debates, the whole schmozzle over verifying parties, which parties are able to contest the elections. So it doesn't seem to have been as competent as election commissions a couple of elections ago. But nonetheless, I would have thought, at least nationally, it would be unlikely that there will be technical glitches, but there will be unlikely to be anything of a magnitude that would make you say this is no longer a fair election process. Okay. But it'd be very interesting to know about those local cases, and I don't know it.
I see Nava has a quick comment, and Rito does too, I think. Yeah,
I don't think, there will be, very blatant frauds like tampering with ballot papers or changing the results. But, we've been seeing a lot of media reports of like strategic manipulation of the campaign using state resources, especially by Jokowi, Prabowo, politicizing law enforcement agency, deploying the law to undermine their rivals and all. So, I mean, I won't repeat the examples that are already abundant in the media. But what I'm saying is that other candidates are also incumbents in some ways, Ganjar PDIP, Muhaimin PKB holds the Kemendes, the Ministry of Village. So and there have been reports as well that I've heard when I was in Indonesia of both, not just Prabowo Gibran, but also Ganjar and also Muhaimin using their respective ministries for campaigning. For example, the Kemendes, some of the newly hired civil servants, I was told that they have been instructed to post at least 10 social media contents per day, and then they have to report, and it will be monitored by their superior in the ministry. And I mean, from PDIP side, I think yesterday, Habibur Rahman from TKN Prabowo Ganjar announced in their press conference that they received reports of PDIP trying to bribe or trying to hold a meeting with election workers in Jember KPUD. So I mean, I don't know what Sydney was the one that Sydney was referring to is KPUD in Sulawesi, but the one reported by TKN was in Jember. So I mean, all sides kind of report each other for frauds, and I think people are not surprised anymore at this stage. So it just describes how not exactly clean or free this election is.
Thank you so much, Nava. Rito, did you want to add something?
Yeah. So if electoral fraud happens on a very massive scale, I think that would be the one factor. No, not one factor, but it will be crossing the threshold or the red line of elite consensus, right? Because that would really the rules of the game so far is that we know that elites have pretty much been tolerant despite all this executive aggrandizement, right? So far as they're getting a slice of the pie. This has to do with the bagi-bagi sort of informal consensus in Indonesian politics, party cartelization. Dan Slater has written a lot about that. But if electoral fraud is happening on a massive scale, that would be the one factor that destroys this consensus. So there will be, elite dissent, and this can translate or unfolds to, perhaps a widespread protest.
That's a really excellent point, I think, Rito. And that's it, sort of trying to kind of distinguish between sort of pressure and politicization of these electoral institutions as compared to sort of, ballot stuffing or, outright systematic fraud on a large scale. And it seems from and we've had these sorts of reports in previous elections, in fact, but it does, as Nava and Gregor pointed out, seem much more persistent and much more or it's being raised a lot more in this election, that there's kind of arahan, or people are getting directed to kind of put the pressure on the people in their communities to vote a certain way. But that doesn't necessarily translate into the votes that, whether it's Jokowi Gibran or PDIP, they actually want. There was a lot of this talk in 2019 as well, Jokowi mobilizing state resources and putting a lot of pressure on regional governments and the like, and bureaucracies to get people to vote a certain way, and it didn't necessarily end up turning out that way. So it sounds like there's a lot of pressure, but we don't necessarily think that will turn into outright fraud, right? So there are also a lot of questions, as I predicted there would be, on TikTok, Instagram, and the youth vote. So there's been some Australian media coverage of this as well, right? That Indonesia has this really large young population. I think I forget the numbers now, but so over 50% of voters these days are kind of under 30. And that the Prabowo Gibran campaign in particular has invested a lot of time and resources into online campaigning, creating kind of strong and attractive, TikTokable gimmicks. Does anyone think that this really matters? Young people have always kind of gravitated towards Prabowo. I don't really know why. But with Gibran on his ticket, he does seem to now be really the president of choice for young people. Young people are also less likely to go to the polls statistically and historically. So this is a big question, how important is the youth vote this year? And why are the young people so into Prabowo? It's a genuine question. Does anyone want to sort of step in there and offer their analysis? You're the youngest on the panel, I think, Nava, we decided. So you have to answer this question.
I don't have my own TikTok account, so I'm not. But I mean, yeah, the young people matters because, they constitute, over half of the voters this time, right? So just because of the sheer number. And I mean, many surveys show that people who vote for Prabowo is, because because of his image as tegas, and then because of Jokowi's endorsement. So there are all sorts of reasons, and I think the young people are not that unique in terms of their preference why they like Prabowo. I mean, I've heard a lot of anecdotal examples. I think it's because Prabowo benefits from, he seems authoritative because this is his third time running. So like most people already know who he is, and he's got that I don't know, maybe he's got an authority just from his track, even and people, the fact that his human rights abuse allegations were never really resolved 100%. So he could just, kind of say, oh, these are all just smear campaign. Some people say that the young people are too young to know about all the things that happened during New Order. I mean, I don't think that's a good reason. I think they know, but they don't really care, or maybe that it's and many young people also said, what I know from anecdotal examples is that Prabowo is brave and tegas. And that's what they look for in a leader. And of course, they're concerned with employment. And if they're happy with Jokowi's economic performance, like what Rido said, then it's just a logical conclusion to go with Prabowo.
Rido, did you want to add anything?
As the second youngest person here, perhaps I should say something, right? After Nafa, right? So yeah, that's what's been puzzling my mind as well, Eve, right? Well, why are young voters so into Prabowo, right? But I'm not really an expert on social media, and I guess we can invite someone who are more of an expert, on this field. But my guess is because nowadays youngsters are more attuned to the social media, more into obsessed with becoming influencers rather than participating actively in the social movement space, for example, right? So I remember that this makes me sound like an old guy, but I'm going to say back during my days, when I was, an undergrad at UI, we were so into participating in organizations, civil society movement and so on. I was in Badan Eksekutif Mahasiswa, right? So we would be aware of all the, we would be more attuned to all these sorts of social political discussions, but perhaps now the trend has changed, right? Those kind of civil society organizations are losing interests among young people. Again, this is just my guess, right? And further research is needed, but at least that's what I'm seeing on my end.
I think it's what I think is missing in some of the international analysis on the youth vote is that because BEM, Badan Eksekutif Mahasiswa, the student executive body in universities, some of them have been ultra critical actually of Jokowi, right? And of the Jokowi Gibran, so the engineering of Gibran onto the Prabowo ticket. But the mistake is to associate Indonesia's university student movement and how they feel and what their political, how they articulate their political preferences with the youth of Indonesia generally, who are of course divided just as the rest of the population are in terms of their socioeconomic status, their religious leanings, the organizations that they move in. And I think that, your point, Rido, is that, there's this whole other body of youth, probably beyond BEM, that are perhaps potentially just much more attracted to a tegas strongman, a nationalist who sort of talks about Indonesia being sort of taking its rightful place on the international stage as well, and who are very much buried in their social media lives, just like my niece. Yes, I'm the second oldest on the platform. So I see the social media through my niece. So we're running out of time. There's been quite a bit, and there's a few questions here that I think kind of relate. There's a Benang Merah here, and they're sort of interested in a Prabowo president, how Prabowo would govern, but also how would he handle coalitions and where would PDIP end up in all of this? Mega has a history of not forgiving. She still has this sour relationship with SBY. If Prabowo wins, and this is a question, I guess, for you, Greg, what kind of president do we expect him to be in terms of the way he would handle the coalitions, whether he would bring in the opposition, whether it's Anies or whether it's Ganjar and PDIP back into the fold, you know, or is it just going to be more sort of patronage politics as we know it, or could there be a real opposition in a Prabowo presidency? Because PDIP has soured so much with Jokowi.
The PDIP issue is a really interesting one, and we know, thinking back to, when was it, 2009, when Prabowo was Megawati's running mate in that presidential election, and they courted each other for, what was it, 18 months or so, the possibility of Prabowo being supported by PDIP. So we know there's a good relationship there. I think one of the most interesting questions is, if Prabowo is elected and there is some kind of rupture between Jokowi and Prabowo, how might Prabowo lessen the risk to his presidency? And one way of doing this would be to bring in PDIP, because if it's true that he's somewhat resentful of Jokowi, it's not hard to find major parties in the political system that are far more resentful towards Jokowi. PDIP is one of them, of course, but Golkar, PAN, PKB, lots of parties have been pushed around, manipulated, and to some degree coerced by Jokowi over the last few years. And I think they would be very happy to turn against him and to limit his influence on any new government. So I think in that scenario, the possibility of a reconciliation between Prabowo and PDIP, and using PDIP as a kind of stabilising influence on the government, I think that would be a very interesting move. As an election candidate, he's got 9 parties. Prabowo's got 9 parties in his coalition, and he's very almost punctilious about always including them. He goes through the list, even though most of the people listing haven't heard of the last few parties because they're small and new and the like. But nonetheless, he always, or nearly always, has the people on stage, and he mentions their name. So he shows deference to them. That might just be a campaign observation that he's doing, but it shows you that he is capable of keeping a coalition together if he wants to. And the last question, I think, just very briefly, one of the big issues we always feared, if he got elected in 2014 or 2019, he would have brought in very dramatic changes very quickly. He was impatient to make Indonesia a much less democratic place than what it was. And over the last few years, many commentators have said, well, all he has to do is copy what Jokowi is doing, which is gradual changes, incremental changes, and you end up in the same place, and you don't arouse any of the sort of massive opposition and alarm that you might do if you suddenly want to, I don't know, shut down Parliament or something like that, dramatically change the constitution. So I think that's one of the key things for us to look for if Prabowo is elected, is he going to be an impatient, bull at the gate kind of president, or is he going to bide his time and allow things to proceed very slowly but surely, that by the end of that process, he will have concentrated power and minimised the opposition. I think that's one of the interesting things. Neither of those scenarios is very good for Indonesia's democratic prospects, but nonetheless, yeah.
Well, you've actually answered my last question, which is all about Indonesia's democratic prospects. So I might sort of, last final minutes, offer Nava and Rita an opportunity to comment on basically Greg's last question. And I mean, it's, how worried should we used to be, or analysts, foreign analysts and local analysts as well in Indonesia, and human rights activists were always extraordinarily worried about the prospect of a Prabowo presidency. It's 10 years since he first ran in 2014. And we, ANU experts wrote that Jokowi saved Indonesian democracy from its first real major threat since the end of the New Order era. Nava, do you think that we should still be as worried under President Prabowo? And how would an opposition, the Islamic, you've followed the opposition under Jokowi, what would it look like to oppose a Prabowo president?
Well, I think even in the best case scenario of Prabowo presidency, he would merely continue Jokowi's legacy. I mean, Jokowi has provided him with all this authoritarian toolkit, which, you know, he may use, he may combine, mix and match as he likes. Don't forget that, you know, so in the best case scenario, he would just continue Jokowi's illiberal practices, like co-opting the KPK, you know, intervening in the judiciary matters and so on. But don't forget that he will also take a full advantage of some of the problematic legislations that will come into fruition this year, like the penal code, the new KUHP, the new UU ITE, the information electronic transaction law, so which will enable him, you know, or make it easier for him to criminalize any kind of opposition activists than, you know, than that Jokowi has already done. And also, you know, I think in the best case scenario, again, maybe Prabowo will use his position to enrich himself, to reconfigure the elite arrangements in his favor, instead of, you know, upending the formal democratic system. But I think I don't even want the best case scenario. It's not it's not exactly a beacon for democracy, right? And I mean, what happens if, you know, there are sudden shocks, like, I don't know, global economic crisis, and if it results in social unrest, how would Prabowo respond to that? I think the baseline for our thinking is that most leaders would resort to what they know best. And yeah, not to mention when what happens if his relationship with Jokowi deteriorated. We only have to look to what happened with Duterte and Marcos. You know, Duterte was even more popular than Jokowi, and now he's, you know, once his popularity waned, you know, Marcos just sidelined him. Would Prabowo do the same thing? I mean, and what would this political struggle, how would that affect democracy? So there are too many uncertainties.
Great questions, though. And Rido, final thoughts on, you know, Prabowo presidency and what it would mean for democracy in Indonesia?
Yeah, I think we should really move beyond the military-civilian dichotomy in our analysis of whether or not a leader would break, you know, the democratic consensus and the rule of law, right? Because if there's any lesson to be learned from the past, SBY was of military background, but he pretty much stick to democratic principles, right? And you said it yourself, Eve, back during the hype of Jokowi's ascendancy in 2016, 2017. You know, many scholars at the ANU praised that, but then a couple of years after, it turned out that it was Jokowi, bread and butter civilian, man of the people, who actually, you know, transgressed some of these democratic consensus that we've built ever since the Reformasi. So we should really move beyond that dichotomy. So I would say I'm cautiously optimistic about Prabowo's presidency, and hopefully he has learned from the past, and he has learned from his predecessor that his own father-in-law as well, right? Hopefully he has learned from that, and hopefully he's learned that, you know, continuously, if, you know, he would think twice about further breaking the democratic rules that we have established in 1998. So I guess that's my message.
Wonderful. It's an excellent note to end on, because we're bang on time with 1 minute to go. And that 1 minute, I just want to thank everyone who attended, and for everyone's questions. I couldn't go one by one. There were too many, so I had to just sort of smush them together and try and aggregate them. So I do apologize if I didn't get to yours, or if I didn't attribute these questions correctly. But mostly, I really want to thank our panelists for their time. They're very busy people. They're doing lots of fascinating work on Indonesian politics, and I'm just very grateful that Greg, Nava, and Ridho could be with us today to offer their expert analysis. And we'll be running something in a similar event, of course, after the elections as well, where we kind of sit around and talk about how right or wrong we were, and so you'll hear about that in the coming weeks as well. So terima kasih banyak atas perhatiannya. Thank you very much, everyone, and that's it from us.
Thank you, Eve.
Thank you so much, Eve. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you.